Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, a podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. So this week, we're joined by Peps, Mccrea, Jen Barker, and Chris Such. Hi guys, how are you?
Yeah, good,
I'm
thank you.
good.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to explore your recent paper, sort of continuing the discussion on special education needs and disabilities in schools. But Jen, it's your first time on the podcast, so I thought maybe we'd start with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Great, thank you. So my job title is National Director of Learning. I work at Ormiston Academies Trust, which is a 45 school trust that's very geographically dispersed. I started as a primary school teacher, primary and early years teacher in 2004, spent 10 years, nearly 10 years in the classroom, many of which I spent as Senko. And, like all teachers and leaders, have thought a lot about how we might best improve the education provision for our most kind of vulnerable pupils. CEO of Ormiston, as many of you will know, is Tom Rees, who has a particular interest, I think, in exploring, kind of interrogating, again, what we might do to improve the provision and the outcomes for pupils with SEND. And so being able to work alongside him and alongside many of the colleagues in our AP and specialist settings, and of course, obviously, colleagues in who are supporting pupils with SEND in mainstream schools. It's been a bit of a journey for all of us as we, I think, really start to interrogate why the outcomes for pupils with SEND are not where we need them to be, and give due credit and consideration to what we can do to address it.
I mean, it feels like the biggest thing on school leaders, school teachers' minds at the moment. I actually tried to arrange a chat with Tom and potentially Ben about their paper, but obviously Tom being a very, very senior leader, it was almost impossible to align diaries. But I saw in your paper you not necessarily pay homage, but you tip your hat to where the thinking almost started and things like that. I mean, Peps, is that how you got involved? To just sort of seeing that conversation unfold, or was there something else that sort of took place?
I think that this, like you say, this is an increasingly important topic for schools, and it is a good time to be trying to sort it out. Essentially, we kind of had a slight change of government. The time is now to try and sort this out if we're ever going to have a chance to sort it out. And so, yes, a bit of prompting from Tom and a few chats with Jen to help me understand what some of the evidence base underneath this might look like, meant that it was just a great opportunity really to spend some time digging into it and figuring it out.
And I think, we're obviously going to spend time talking about it, but I think it makes sense to begin with a little bit about the rationale. Why this paper and why now?
For me, you can kind of boil it down to three things. So anything that we do in education, we want it to be feasible and sustainable for the government and the people who need to pay for it. We want it to work for teachers who need to spend their time, delivering it and attending to it. And most importantly, we want it to make a difference for children. And I think it's quite clear that currently none of those things are true. It's not feasible and sustainable. There's been a 50% increase in terms of funding. We're about to bankrupt multiple local authorities because of the investment that they need to make in sort of maintaining or establishing and maintaining provision. We have a workforce that feels, I think, probably increasingly lacking in confidence and disempowered to do the right thing or do what they think is the right thing for pupils. And we don't see pupil outcomes increasing. Their academic outcomes are poorer, but we know that their mental health and wellbeing outcomes are poorer. They are more at risk of exclusion. Their kind of long-term outcomes are similarly, they don't paint a positive picture. And so when you triangulate kind of those three things, it's not a good. It's a system that's not really working for anybody. I do also think, to Peps's point, we have had a change in government, and Bridget has indicated, I think, her own kind of personal interest in this. So there's a bit of momentum and interest, I think, building politically, which is important. That's going to pave the way for the white paper, which will hopefully come out in September. So in some senses, this, those kind of stars have aligned. This feels like a good point to be agitating, I think, for further interrogation. I don't think the paper, and I don't think anybody has any of the answers, but I think you can start by hopefully asking better questions and start sort of introducing some clarity and some sort of thoughtful ideas into the system.
Yeah, and for me, it felt like it was a good point to kind of stop and take stock of where we're at. If some decisions are going to start to be made around reforming the system, which clearly they have to be, they need to be based on kind of a really rigorous understanding of the reality of the situation and why that's happening. I think this was just like a good opportunity to try and gather as much of the kind of evidence as possible and have a really good hard think about like why we're in this situation. Because I often, Chris will be kind of, I'm sure, sick of me talking about this kind of piece of the puzzle, but it's like if you don't really understand the mechanics of the situation, the kind of causality of the situation, then there's a real risk that you can end up doing things, constructing a solution that actually doesn't help anymore or makes it worse and things like that. And so, SEND, a bit like education in general, is highly complex, and the clearer you can get on that kind of messy internal mechanics, the better your chance of coming up with a solution that kind of works. I also think there's something about, we're facing a range of challenges as a society more generally, and I feel like the kind of SEND piece almost like cuts across some of that. And so by beginning to like bring this increasingly into our lens, I think it also might help. It was a bit perhaps of a like unrealistic aspiration, but maybe it might help us as a sector and maybe even wider as a society to begin to understand like how to tackle some of those wider challenges we face as well.
I think anyone who encounters this paper, and just a reminder of the title, I think what's it, Inclusive Teaching, a discussion paper, you two are the authors alongside Josh Goodrich. I think anyone who encounters it will notice as they read it the same mixture of accessibility and nuance that those who have read your work or have worked with you will be familiar with. What I particularly like about it is how readable it is, and a big part of that is it being broken down into 3 sections of 5. So 5 system strain indicators that show us that something isn't quite right, 5 potential drivers of that failure, and then 5 things that 5 principles that might allow schools to do something about that. And I'd just like to start by asking you about those systemic drivers of failure that you mentioned. Is there one of them or one aspect of that that you feel is like hitting schools in a particularly sharp or particularly problematic way more than the others?
Yeah, and just to say, like the whole like 555, I'm unable to actually write anything that doesn't have a systematic structure, being like a maths teacher and like semi-OCD type writer. You're just lucky all of the titles weren't on what's it called when you have like secure success, alliterative. Okay, it's like managed to let go of my own personal needs for long enough to be able to do that.
Just a sec. I'm just thinking, actually, before you answer that, for the sake of the audience, it might be worth me kind of spelling out what I should have done, which is what those 5 kind of key signs of failure that are detailed.
Good idea.
So one of them is poor outcomes that we see both in terms of things, in terms of academic results, exclusion rates
for students, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. A lack of kind of capacity across the system and resulting conflict that's experienced by schools and parents and carers, a potential for inequitable access, teacher workload and a lack of preparedness, and the final of those 5, unsustainable rising costs. And we see that in the fact that EHCPs, as you mentioned in the paper, in primary schools have doubled since 2015. So out of those 5 things, is there any one thing that you think is kind of most sharply affecting the system, or one that you notice more than others?
We're all here because we care about the outcomes for kids, and I think obviously how you go about increasing the likelihood that we can improve outcomes for kids is the thing that we're all thinking a lot about. I think the one that I spend most of my time thinking about, we work with, I don't know, circa 3,000 teachers at Ormiston, and in spending time with them, I'm it never fails to amaze me just how stretched everybody is, how frantic, frenetic, and sometimes like overly challenging the work is. And I think we've somehow kind of got to this point, probably through, we've got an incredibly committed, like well-intentioned workforce. I don't think we have I don't think we've created the conditions for them like particularly well to be like to be successful in the way that perhaps other professions have been able to do. And there are lots of things that have sort of come into play to create this kind of situation. I don't think we have a particularly strong evidence base that we're operating within. I don't think we've worked hard enough to define some of the constructs or some of the important things that we want to be true. We, I think, released like enormous amounts of guidance from different places that comes through kind of policy or statutory guidance. There's or training. It's very I think it can be very difficult to interpret. It's not specific enough. I think it's highly at risk of kind of lethal mutations. We use very vague and complex language, I think, and we've created a situation where I don't think it's realistic or fair to expect the workforce to sort of continue doing, what it's doing. We also don't have good measures of quality assuring or understanding the impact, I think, of a lot of what we're trying to do. So for me, this idea of improving those conditions, creating a workforce that feels confident and empowered and able to do the things that are going to make the biggest difference for pupils. Yeah, that's the one that I think is sort of experienced most acutely in schools. Although of course they're all important.
Also, I think there's a cost piece, which I think in some ways you can just say that is the biggest issue overall. Councils are at risk of basically going under. The government earmarked, was it like 6-7 billion more for education, and I think all of that's going to be swallowed up by the kind of debt that councils had, and there's still not going to be enough. So there's something like wildly wrong there. And but setting that to one side, it's important to recognize that needs to be fixed. Otherwise, like the SEND system will not only have issues, but the rest of the education system will have all sorts of knock-on problems, which is not good. But building on what Jen was saying about asking a lot of schools, but not necessarily giving them the guidance or tools to be able to do a really good job of that. I think alongside that, we have this expansion of demand in terms of provision, with this like kind of fixed or even declining budget, which means that we end up with this increasing dilution of resources. So essentially, teachers are just being spread thinner and thinner and thinner, being asked to do more for more and more students, which means that essentially, because the needs of students are not equal across the board. Okay, some students have greater needs than others. And when that resource gets diluted across a broader range of students with differing needs, there's a real risk that those students with the greatest needs are the ones who end up like losing out the most. And I think that for me is the kind of sharpest piece of this whole puzzle, as it were, and the least fair piece, and the bit that we have to just kind of try and protect and look out for as much as possible. It's a kind of like unintended consequence of trying to like do good, if that makes sense. We're trying to help as many students as possible, trying to be really supportive, but actually what's ended up happening is we're like potentially disadvantaging those who need the most help.
The part that got me thinking most was the discussion of that kind of sense of conflict that has been created between parents and carers, often who are doing everything within their power to get the support that their children require, and that sense of conflict that often ends up happening between them and a school or between them and a local authority as they try and seek these things. And I couldn't help but think about the way that arguably, at least maybe this is obviously subjective, but in the 20 years or so I've been in education, I think various systemic forces have increased that sense of conflict in a lot of ways, be it from parents on WhatsApp and social media, be it some loss of trust following lockdowns, all these kind of things. And this just feels like the kind of sharp end of that. It feels like that this is the most extreme version of that conflict. And so I think about meetings I've been in where a parent has been trying to get really necessary support for a pupil who really shouldn't have been in mainstream education in, say, years 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then finally they're getting to go to somewhere that will be able to provide them with what they need, but only by year 7 and far too late. So for me, obviously, as Jen mentioned, all of this stuff matters, and all of these in many ways are different, faces of the same object. But for me, the bit that kind of stood out and made me sit up a bit was that reminder of just how tense and those relationships can end up being between parents and carers and schools and local authorities because of these systemic pressures.
Yeah, 100%. And if you're not, if you're not a family who experiences that, you might not realize it, but it's really bad. It's really pretty bad and tough and hard and ugly. And
yeah, I specifically remember the parent in question arriving to our school, and she was fantastic. Always had a wonderful relationship with the school, but she arrived in with like 3 or 4 folders worth of things that she'd had to put together and to accumulate in order to try and help the process of ensuring her son got the support that he obviously needed. And I couldn't help at the time to think about the parents and carers who wouldn't have the time or the resources, and this kind of idea is mentioned in the paper as well, to be able to go through the system in that way. So yeah, it's obviously a system that's ripe for change.
Yeah, and just to kind of call out what you're talking about there, there's this there's the kind of dilution of resources, but that's not distributed equally across the system. Essentially, there's some very compelling evidence to suggest that those families and geographical areas which are most affluent end up basically being able to access greater provision. So yeah, if you have 2 groups of both with the same numbers of students with SEND, if one of those groups is more affluent, then there's more chance that they end up having EHCPs. And that's that's again coming back to this these unintended consequences. Frustratingly, it's those students who kind of need the most support are the ones who are kind of ending up with the rawest deal along the way.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about cultural capital in schools, but when we really mean cultural literacy. But that's an example for me of cultural capital, because groups of parents who understand how the system works can mold it in their shape, and it feels like that's what you're describing. I mean, what the paper does for me really well is it puts a name on the sense of exasperation that a lot of teachers are feeling, a lot of leaders are feeling. Like I hear my friends who are senior leaders talking about the situation in school, and exasperation is probably the only way I can describe it. But at the start of the paper, you put a name on that. But then you also give what I feel is a decent modicum of control to the teacher, to the school leader. And like, how do your 5 principles shift resource and professional energy away from almost being reactive towards the proactive design of an approach?
This is it's a great question. I think, and in the schools that I go into, which are most challenging, I think one of the main features of a challenging school is where much more time, energy, and resource is invested in what you might call downstream activity. So the fallout, or just the result of like more challenging experiences, or lower prior attainment, or more adversarial experiences between kind of families and schools. And I think some schools end up in quite vicious circles. The harder the more time that you're spending in that space, the harder it is to sort of step back and spend time to kind of look upstream and start putting things into place that might mitigate, the impacts or the likelihood that some of those things arise. And it's an incredibly difficult shift. I think it's one of the main things that sort of characterizes like a school improvement journey, how a school makes the space and time to attend to that, that which is, kind of considered upstream activity. I think for me, there's like a few things that stand out. So one is like a huge part of this is understanding what the evidence suggests is going to be to be most effective. And whilst that's an easy thing to say, actually behaving in ways that, you know, reflects that, I think it can be very challenging. One of the things, obviously, that we talk a bit about in the paper is this sort of shared model of teaching. We call it a shared model of learning and teaching at Ormiston, but this idea that you know, the way that pupils think, the way that we can create conditions within which human beings can thrive, are probably more similar than they are different. And to me, that sort of distills into two very broad categories. So we want incredible cultures. We want incredibly kind of positive environments where pupils feel a strong sense of belonging, where they feel that they're relevant and they have high quality relationships with somebody in school. And we want we want really high quality teaching, which attends to, you know, everything that we know about kind of human cognitive architecture. I think alongside that, we want to create space for sort of early sort of diagnosis, early recognition of, you know, challenges that are going to arise for pupils, whatever they may be, whether they relate to individuals' behaviour or sort of cognition and learning, and being able to put things in place almost before, you know, anything becomes a problem. I've heard Leora talk about a session that she saw. It was led by somebody from the EEF, and, you know, this colleague was saying that actually so much of what you do in the sort of the earlier space or the early intervention space, like, becomes preventative. Like, if you can get to the point where we have a good enough understanding of, you know, risks around learning to read or whatever it is, actually, if you can intervene at that point, the amount of time and energy and just general anxiety and what have you that you can mitigate further down the line is really significant. So I think for me, it's being able to obviously get to the kind of the root cause of the issue, which again can be very difficult. We need to access really accurate, kind of granular and specific information about what is going on, and then use that as much as possible to attend. And it sounds like an easy thing to do. Oh, don't do this downstream stuff. Just make the culture really good and teach people well. I think we need to do a better job of building a narrative around how hard those things are to do and do well, and just create much more time for people to attend to that, rather than the many other things that we're asking people to do. My sense is that when I go into the best schools that I go into, you know, whether, yes, they have high outcomes, but you have kids that just love going to school and just, you know, they value and appreciate every aspect of their education. It's where, if you talk to teachers, the vast majority of their time is spent understanding how they can create the culture and how they can interrogate the teaching to the most granular kind of possible level. That's what they're spending their time doing, and that's what leaders are enabling them to do. They're clearing as much, you know, stuff sort of out of the way, so that, yeah, that's where the most amount of resources invested.
The cultural piece is huge, isn't it? And yeah, we did like the Step Lab documentary, you know, the last year, the year before, working with Reach and so on, and that's an example of when you get the culture really right, and the instruction, actually, when you get the teaching really right, like they need to intervene downstream in individualistic ways, like really produces. So, you know, that clip that I'm sure is quite famous now of Pritesh teaching ionic bonding to his year 9 science group. There are 2 kids in there with EHCPs, and there's nothing that's being done differently for them at all. And yet every single kid in that class is on the bus, as it were. They're learning loads, they're being successful, and they're going to, you know, get great, like, results, and like feel really confident and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a good push to, like, see the somewhat tenuous but really important link between culture and outcomes for students. I think there's another important piece, which you know, when you start to dig into the evidence, really helps us as schools to grapple with this and do a better job and be more upstream, which is this idea that actually, despite its allure, focusing on the individual can sometimes backfire. All right, so, you know, as a culture, we live in this society where we quite rightly, take great pride in liberal values, in like the the importance of the individual and freedom, and making sure that we're catering to everyone's needs, and that to a certain degree everyone is different and special, and that's absolutely important. However, sometimes we can do things that actually interfere with achieving those end goals, and sometimes those things that we do that interfere with those end goals are actually treating people in too individualistic a way. So, the act of allocating labels to students is a good example of this. By giving students a label, yes, it can, it's really important because it helps students and families to access resources and further support. But if we're not careful, the way we use that label can also lead teachers to have lower expectations of those students, can lead students themselves to have lower expectations of themselves. Some evidence to suggest that when students get labeled, they end up like being less aspirational about what university they want to go to. And it can, as you can imagine, create like a sense of stigma and reduce feelings of belonging within the classroom. And so there's all these kinds of things that can come into play whenever we think about learners too much through this individualistic lens. And actually, the more you dig into the evidence, like what Jen was saying about the importance of cognitive similarity, as in that, the way we learn is much more similar than it is different. We got our fingers burned with learning styles where we try to personalize things too much. We got our fingers burned again with, what's the other example?
UDL, is that universal design?
Yes, yeah, universal aspects of universal design for learning. There's more anyway. Basically, anytime we try to get too individualistic, it tends to backfire. Whereas, when you go further upstream and treat education as a more collective, inclusive endeavor, you tend to like, yeah, these like not have things arise which end up sucking your time and also backfire for students. I'm not sure whether that's clear at all. In my head, crystal clear, but Chris, does that make any sense? Anything you'd add or argue about?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, really clear. Obviously, I can't help but interpret this stuff through the lens of literacy. And a really good example of this embracing cognitive similarity, thinking about shared needs rather than individual deficits, relates to learning to read. I mean, it's quite common for teachers to say to me things like, I've got this pupil, they're struggling to learn to read. In particular, they seem to be struggling with the foundations. Phonics doesn't seem to be working. I don't want to teach them how to read on the basis of like decoding individual words on the basis of their sounds. What should I do that's going to work for this individual student? And I have to say, well, the nature of the English writing system is that it's initially created to represent sounds. So if you can't decode words, you won't become a fluent reader. So ultimately, there is that same like endeavor that everyone has to go through in order to become a fluent reader. And yet as I say, the nature of trying to individualize support can often push people away from this fairly sensible idea. Obviously, that's not to say that pupils don't have individual needs, so they can struggle with different aspects of decoding. And as you talk about in your paper, it's still really important to recognize, the individual needs and respond to those. But at the same time, wherever possible, kind of adapting minimally and appropriately, another of the principles from your paper, seems to make most sense, because we are learning, not only do we learn in relatively similar ways, often we are generally trying to get kids to learn the same body of knowledge or the same set of skills.
Yeah, a great example. Yeah, and so that's where the danger lies, right? If you have like, or if you're using a solid approach to teaching for your whole class, and then you are, for whatever reason, trying to do something different for somebody, um, then you're going to by necessity be doing something less effective for them, and it's that student who needs the most who's getting the like less effective strategy. That's all sorts of wrong, right? um, and so yeah, I think we somehow have got to get over this notion that treating people as special and different is always good, and that sometimes just doing what we do for everyone else, perhaps doing a bit more of it, perhaps providing additional support or some additional scaffolds along the way, is probably a kind of a better way overall, making less of a big deal about that difference.
I mean, as I was reading, I was nodding, but it felt as if this element and the sort of section on diagnoses may be the bits that get the most pushback if this discussion paper prompts further discussion. Do you agree with that? And would actually some sort of formal pushback help the conversation along? How do you think that sits? Because in my mind, diagnosis can be a really emotive element in sort of social media discourse.
Yeah, what would be? Can you give us an example? What would be the push? Imagine you're the pusher, Kieran. What would the back be?
So when I sort of see conversations on social media, if someone has personal experience of sort of special educational need or disability, then it shapes how they respond to these kind of conversations. So, for instance, dyslexia as an example, it becomes a very personal and specific element. If we, so I think that ties into Chris's thing. What we need are people or readers to sort of step back and go, actually, in the main, there are ways that we can think more effectively about our approach to this. But the pushback may come from the fact that we have a personal experience tied up with specific examples. Am I making sense?
I think you're making sense. Yeah, this is something that I have thought a lot about, and I think there's kind of for me, there's sort of two. There's two. Well, yeah, there's two things to think about. One is the fact that the reasons that a person might push for or see a diagnosis as a valuable thing to do. I think there's two reasons why that might happen. One, I think, is let's say more from an identity perspective. Like this individual, in order to understand their place in the world, their own life experience, the way that life plays out for them, the relationships that they have, the way that they engage with the world, the sorts of traits and experiences, that sort of wider kind of identity piece is one driver. And then I think the other driver is, another driver, there may be more, is because they think, and I think this is certainly true of people who push for diagnoses in educational settings, is because it's a gateway to resource or funding or something. And I think it's important to sort of potentially decouple those things. So I don't think any of us are saying that nobody should have a diagnosis, and if from a personal sort of identity perspective this is something which is important for the individual, then that's up to that individual, and it's not really for anybody else to tell them that they should or shouldn't be doing that. I think the challenge is, because of the issues that we highlight in the paper, so the idea of something like construct validity, the challenge is when you try and formally link a prescription or some specific intervention or some specific resource to that diagnosis. The sorts of conditions, maybe that's not the right word, that we're talking about, because they have lower construct validity, they lack the sorts of empirical anchors, they've been called, that perhaps more medically related conditions might have. So if you take the example of blood pressure, for example, it's a very easy thing to diagnose. It's very easy to link a prescription. That prescription might not work for absolutely everybody, but in broad terms, that's quite a simple thing to sort of diagnose and prescribe for. Where you adopt that into education, it doesn't work as well. And I think that's where we see the problems occur. We've assumed that because a diagnosis might be a helpful thing for a person, we've sort of assumed that you can use that as the basis of a diagnosis or an intervention or some form of sort of prescribed activity, and I think the evidence suggests it doesn't work. They're too broad. They lack the construct validity to do that well enough, and that's where we see these very, I think, to some extent lacking in evidence, sort of responses that ultimately they don't address the challenges that the individual faces.
Yeah, and then you have all sorts of interventions which are kind of used almost agnostic to the semi-agnostic to the diagnosis, like fidget spinners, great example. You know, lots of schools use fidget spinners and believe that they are a helpful intervention, and yet when you dig into the evidence, it's not. They aren't. Like, most recent meta-analyses say that it's just they're not a helpful tool for students with ADHD, or for pretty much most students. And so there's not only are there issues at the kind of like construct validity end of knowing what a particular condition looks like in a clear and concrete way, but then there's also issues with even if we did know, is this intervention an effective intervention, and how do we help schools to kind of know that it is or it isn't as well.
Yeah, and the more time that teachers I think you create an illusion of support, because the reality is that by and large these things are not that they're not making the difference that teachers want to be able to make with their children. I think you create confusion on the part of teachers who are sort of being told that these things might help, but they can see that they're not. And that that's the kind of, at best, even if we would assume the impact of these were neutral, it's a dreadful thing that's what teachers are spending their time doing. I actually don't think they are neutral in lots of ways. I think they're worse than neutral. They contribute to children spending time on things that we don't want them to spend time on, kids being removed and separated from the group that they want to feel connected to and relevant within and belonging for. And we're of course removing them from the opportunity to be in receipt of really high quality instruction. And the collective impact of those things is obviously really damaging.
A very uncharitable perspective would be that sometimes, like, giving a kid a fidget spinner is like an easy solution or an easy quick fix, whereas actually trying to help that, but like the example you said earlier, Chris, trying to basically improve your reading instruction and providing them with the extra support that they need, it is a lot more effort and a lot more complex.
Yeah, the kind of classic literacy version of this is something like coloured overlays, because they can be thought of, if you're being very generous, as neutral. If a kid's already got a coloured overlay, they say it helps them and they quite like it, then what harm is it doing? But I've come across schools where the advice is, oh, okay, well, this pupil's recently had a diagnosis of dyslexia, they've been recommended coloured overlays, and as part of some kind of support, despite there being no evidence whatsoever this is beneficial. And then there's the school will say, we're on a bit of a wait and see brief. We're going to give it, see if this over the next couple of months offers some kind of support and maybe this makes a difference before we consider doing X, Y, and Z. And that's not that common, but I've come across it, and you think, well, no, this isn't just a neutral thing then. This is potentially having a negative impact on what schools are doing, because it's offering, if you like, false hope. And so schools aren't necessarily getting down to the business of saying, well, what will actually support this pupil? But yeah, I can't help but frame this stuff through, thinking about aspects of literacy. And dyslexia is a great example of this, because construct validity, it's kind of that there's some degree of agreement among academics about what this might mean, but we still end up with recommendations and from certain celebrities, for example, which will suggest that, oh, well, okay, being dyslexic means you learn and think in completely, profoundly, categorically different ways to everyone else, and you learn to read in categorically different ways to everyone else, despite the consensus of those that study this stuff pointing in a complete opposite direction. And so, often these diagnoses, even while they might seem beneficial under certain circumstances, especially relating to people's identity, helping them to understand the difficulties they might have, why they might run in families and this sort of thing, there are downsides to them as well. And often the downsides in certain circumstances outweigh the upsides.
One of the things that I have been pushed on, I think, helpfully, is that, well, if we're not going to use an individual's diagnosis as a guide to help us sort of curate the educational provision for them, then what are we doing? I think it's a great question. And I think one of the things that, like in my experience, if I think back to when I was teaching my reception and year ones to read, I did not feel confident in really getting to the heart of what specific challenges they might have, for example, around learning to read. We were encouraged to use things like the foundation stage profile as a guide, or to you can give them SATs tests, for example, to understand. And I think they're really poor tools for actually digging into in a really granular and specific way exactly what it is about the nature of the difficulty that is kind of really preventing a child from learning to read. Chris, you and I have talked a little bit in the past about something like DIBELS, which is a reading assessment that I think has come out of the University of, I think it's Oregon. You can tell me if I'm wrong. But one of the things that that sort of battery of tests does, I'm on dodgy ground here because you might tell me that I'm completely wrong with all of these things, but it digs into, in a much more granular and specific way, exactly what the challenge might be that a child is experiencing. So, for example, there are tests around things like letter naming fluency, phonemic segmentation fluency, like nonsense word fluency, word reading fluency. It looks at comprehension as well, and it provides much more granular and specific information upon which I think it would be easier to make judgments about how to sort of treat or how to address that particular challenge. My sense is from my own experience in school and from talking to teachers that we don't have a good starting point when it comes to sort of standardized, like empirically validated assessments that teachers know about, are accessible, they're not hidden behind paywalls, that they feel confident in using to ascertain which intervention they might then sort of put in place. I'm interested in anybody's thoughts about what the sort of path to do a better job of that might look like. I mean, learning to read is a huge one, because we know about readings as a gateway to kind of everything else. What would you say are the ways that we can do a better job of that in terms of how we train teachers to access, use, and kind of deploy these sorts of assessments that we can do instead of using these very broad brush kind of diagnosis based assessments?
And do you think we need more, as a system, invest more in building out more assessments, or are the current kind of provision good enough?
I don't know about the kind of investment side of things, but just again, speaking from my experiences of looking at the literacy aspects of this stuff, I think there are a few components to this. The first starts with the conceptual understanding of the thing that you are looking to assess in the first place. So often I'll speak to teachers and school leaders who are looking to set up appropriate support. And when I say, okay, what's your model of reading? How do you understand it? What problems might a pupil have and why? There isn't often that foundation of understanding of the thing that they're looking to work out. It just isn't there. Or it's somewhat weak, or perhaps maybe they learned about this stuff during their time when they were training to be a teacher, if they're lucky. Often they didn't, but even if they did, it's been a long time since they focused on this stuff. So the first part of this is about working out what's the stuff you do want to go into detail about, like reading or writing or early mathematical development or whatever it might be, and making sure that the people who are going to engage in these assessments have a decent understanding of the kind of like the theory and research behind that. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is then being willing to I want to say almost pin your flag to kind of put a flag in the ground about how specific you're willing to be. Because in theory, you could start looking at every little aspect of something like reading and say, oh, I want to see whether they've learned this GPC, or whether they're excellent at decoding polysyllabic words. You could break it into 100 different assessments if you wanted to, but then you end up with something that schools can't implement. So you have to be always willing to find a line between what's really getting to the precise needs that each pupil might have in a given area and what's attainable. And so ultimately it's kind of those two things. I think it's about supporting schools to understand the thing that you want them to dive into. And once you recognise the basics that you can determine from that, what assessments can you use that are specific enough to be targeting issues efficiently, but not so specific that it just is logistically impossible for a school to organise. Now, I appreciate that's quite broad, but I've been trying to talk about the stuff I know about reading in a way that might apply to other areas. Does that make sense?
Does, and that's in
Yeah.
a subject where the where like dyslexia is reasonably well defined, say compared to something like maths anxiety or dyscalculia, because I think it was 2013 Daniel Ansari wrote a paper, or certainly co-wrote a paper, where he said the burden of proof is on those making the diagnosis. We need a better framework for what this might be. The thought being that, is it an absence of high quality teaching in mathematics? Because I think about, Chris and I always talk about learning trajectories, which Jen you'll be familiar with, in terms of like Clements and Sarama's work, and the granularity of that journey from birth. They go up to 7 years of age, and when I look at that, lots of people are becoming more aware of things like the principles of counting. We can compartmentalize counting into 5 core parts, and we build those up. But within those, there are shades. Counting while touching, while pointing, while just looking. Counting things in a straight line, counting things in circular formation, and that kind of thing. And I think before we try to test things in mathematics, we should probably think about the level of subject expertise. And mathematics, Peps, you'll know, is a massively complex beast. It's a massive domain, but there's a fundamental thread running through it all that amounts to almost like the keystone of each different stage that you move through. And I think, like you said, Jim, granularity in terms of what does counting look like, what does number sense look like, and what are the experiences we need our children to have before we go anywhere near a sort of maths equivalent of Dibbles. Because, like Daniel said in 2013, we're not ready for that conversation yet. I think. I mean, that's certainly where I've landed, and that's probably the way I can say it without offending the most number of people.
And I think maths is a really good example of this idea of like the need to realistically prioritize as well. Because like down the line, should we end up with a system where we are willing to say, we've got a pupil, they struggle with mathematics at primary school, what are we going to look at? Well, in theory, you could look at, do they struggle with proportional reasoning and specifically like ratio fractions, or is it this aspect of geometry? And you could go as granular as you like within that, but ultimately, what's achievable? Are you going to ever be able to run interventions that successfully and meaningfully tackle those things and assess those things in a worthwhile way in the first place? Ultimately, the schools I've seen that are doing sensible things around maths interventions are primarily thinking about mental mathematics, in particular things relating to, say, number bond fluency and multiplication and division fact fluency and its connection to place value, because you get those things in place and a huge amount of mathematics opens up. And it's not that they don't care about all the other bits of maths, it's that they recognize that there are limits on what they can achieve, and so they need to know what to prioritize. And in order to be able to do that initially, as you say, Kieran, they have to have a grasp of this body of knowledge about primary mathematics and the related pedagogy.
And how people learn mathematics.
Precisely.
Yeah. Which is, it's not an easy ask, right? Especially primary teachers have to know a lot of stuff already.
Yeah.
Yeah. What can we as a system do to like help achieve that? Yeah, and I do wonder how much like the role of good semi-centralized curricula play in doing some of the heavy lifting of that.
We've talked a little bit about interventions here, but ultimately what you've said already is about, ideally, though, the extra individualized support can be reserved for those that most need it if the instruction that's in the classroom is as effective as it can possibly be. And a key part of that, you talk about the idea of instruction being accessible by default, which is a key idea in your paper. And I guess what I'd like to ask is, if you've got a teacher who's listening to this and they're not in a position to make changes across their school, but they're just thinking about this idea, accessible by default teaching, and they're thinking, well, what changes might I make in my classroom ready for the new academic year? Have you got any kind of suggestions of like places that they might begin with that, other than of course reading this paper and interpreting it for themselves? Are there any like places to begin with this idea for them?
Yeah, definitely. if we imagine a primary classroom, I've been in lots, and you might have a student who has some reading difficulties, or when kind of describe that, like some kind of special educational need, and you're doing things like you want to try and support them as much as possible, and yet um, your handwriting is really bad as a teacher. The front of your classroom is like full of all sorts of information, and even your board has lots of like redundant like images and text, and like and the contrast of the text that they're seeing and the background that's holding that text. If you got like a weak projector, or the background of your like whiteboard is really mucky, and if the font you're displaying is not a highly readable font, then like you're basically doing lots of things to thwart that child's efforts to read before you even start to like intervene with them. Right. And so I think if I was a teacher listening to this and who wanted to like think even harder about accessible design, I would like get up one of their slideshows, or get their visualizer up, whatever it is, pause themselves in the middle of a lesson, go and sit down at the back of a classroom, and just try and see what that experience might be like for one of the students at the back of the classroom who might have reading difficulties. And I think there's probably a whole bunch of stuff all the bunch of improvements you can make just from off the bat from that position, as it were. Yeah. Well, how does that sound? Am I being unduly harsh?
You're being you're not unduly harsh, but you're unintentionally being harsh on me when I was an NQT. My first lesson observation was one of the key bits of feedback I got was that we don't think the kids will be able to read your handwriting, and that was a real eye opener for me because I didn't even realise. I didn't even realise that it was a bit of a scrawl, and then I analysed it and said, "Oh, okay, I actually have to do something about this." I know there are secondary teachers who get quite upset when people start talking about handwriting being, neat or not. But legibility,
Yeah.
as a baseline, I think is important and something I personally overlooked.
Yeah, it's like, if we're thinking about like what choice of font we want to use to help students read, then of course your handwriting on the board is going to be like is equally important. It's crazy not to think about that. And even just like font size, sometimes it can just be hard for us to remember because we're at the front of the classroom that, sometimes writing in like small font can be hard for people to read at the back. I think there's all sorts of things. And contrast, there are sometimes we are guilty as teachers of trying to make our content look good at the expense of it being able to be accessed, I suppose, to look clear. I think some modern tech actually does a good job of this. Phones like have options that allow you, if you're per-sided, to increase the size of the font, to increase that contrast, to make like the reader view on your phone means that you have like white font and black text, or vice versa, and all of these things are kind of built in and allow the like consummation experience of content on a device like this to be accessible by default. And really, I suppose that's what we want to try and start to step towards a little bit more in the classroom, is learning some of those lessons from the tech world, I suppose, and in particular from graphic design, and applying them to our teaching.
And this presumably goes beyond the visual into stuff like um, clarity of explanation. Again, I'm going to give myself a real hard time as an NQT, but probably second or third lesson observation, I was told something along the lines of, you talk for 60 minutes, and I reckon altogether there are about 3 very, very, very long sentences. And that's ultimately how I ended up taught. I wasn't breaking my sentences down into chunks. I wasn't leaving any pauses really for just to let something I said breathe and to let people think about it. So yeah, presumably this goes beyond the visual into things like explanation, modelling. Would I be right about that?
You definitely would. I'm laughing because I still regularly get told, even after 10 years of teaching primary education, talking far too long and complex sentences. Yes, and for me, actually, that's in all the kind of teacher development I've done, like the personal teacher development where I've been into people's classrooms and sort of teacher coaching. The thing that I have found has added most value is in the scripting and the practicing of teacher exposition. It never fails to amaze me how teachers know that they need to be super concise and targeted and limited with the language that they're using, the number of words that they're using, the pace that they're talking, and then the thing that actually happens when they get up and start talking is completely different. I think that, yeah, certainly where I think I've seen the most value added in terms of teacher development is when time is taken to plan, to script, and to rehearse the delivery of like particularly complex I mean anything, literally anything, like stand up and get your coats on, but also particularly when you're getting to quite kind of complex the teaching of complex concepts. I think it's incredibly difficult to do, and the default is I'll just sort of waffle about this for a while and hope that some of it lands.
So much that comes back to planning. So most of my NQT year was filling out an A4 sheet for every lesson I did, and I spent almost no time thinking, well, this is the crux of the lesson. I'm going to think through, just in my head, I'm just going to think, how am I going to say this? Have I got it down as like a 30-second script that I can almost repeat 3 or 4 times through the lesson to get this idea home?
It's amazing. It sounds like this, and this is a case in point for I think so much of what we're talking about. So much of what we're talking about seems like it's going to be quite easy when you talk about it, but the reality of it takes much more time and conscious planning and energy, to do well. And that's why, this is what we were talking about earlier. We need to clear as much stuff off teachers' plates so that this is what they are spending the vast majority of their time on, because it is so difficult to do well in reality. And because what we don't want is, the first time a teacher's having a go at this is the first, potentially only time that kids are going to encounter this particular language or concept.
Oak National Academy is a good place to go and have a look at if you want to get a feel for some really highly accessible resources and explanation. A bit of a plug for them. They've thought really, really hard about the accessibility piece, and so if you just want to see what some clean slides look like and good explanations and good work like communication flows look like, then that's a great place to dig into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the stuff I've seen, someone gave a talk to one of the groups I was at recently, and it did look very accessible in terms of things like that there. I think Ollie Kev did a thread at one point about the font you should be using during your sort of like your research ed talks and that kind of thing. And that may transfer, because you mentioned font size. I'm pretty sure he said nothing less than 50, but nothing greater than 90 or something along those lines. So I don't know if he blogged about it, but he'd be, if you're talking about graphic design, he'd be the person to go to. Because
it's crazy. Like teaching is in many ways, we do a lot of graphic communication, and yet like graphic design knowledge is such a it's almost absent in teacher training. It's wild. It's like it's a big part of your job, but we're not going to tell you any of the like accumulated like knowledge that we've developed about this particular like thing over the last few decades. I think we can do better, basically.
Yeah, like whiteboard work is like just the clarity of someone kind of modeling something on a whiteboard. And then there are some teachers I observe, they'll model something and there'll be part that they leave on the board. And you just look at it at the end of the lesson and think, yeah, that's a huge part of the reason why I would have understood this as a pupil, even if the pace of the explanations might have been a bit not quite where I'd need it to be as an individual. That there is a kind of, a permanent example of what it is we're learning about and what I'm going to try and apply. And again, not to give myself too much of a hard time, think back to my own teaching. I'd, teach a maths lesson, pop out to, break, come back in, and I'd look at what I was about to rub off the board ready for the next lesson and think, how are pupils possibly meant to interpret that? That's just, it's it's slanted. I don't know whether this equal sign is going with these numbers or these ones. And yeah, a lot of the time it's, a bit of advice I give is don't be scared to slow down and have a little bit more clarity in what you're doing. I know it's especially if you're being observed and this sort of thing, you're tempted to rush, but the teachers I see who just take their time over that visual presentation stuff,
They're disciplined.
yeah,
Disciplined. Yeah.
and that's the word. There's a discipline to it that, yeah, I wish I'd learned.
I mean, I'm thinking back to my IT during teacher training. I'm pretty sure one of the lessons was about how to get the little ants to walk around your title. So that feels like it was less than helpful or not neutral. It's been a long time, so maybe I could be misremembering.
Is a dream a bad dream?
So Jen, you mentioned a couple of times the impact of leadership, and I think that was a lever that Ofsted tried to pull a couple of years ago, and to mixed effect. If you could pull one policy lever at national or local level to accelerate your model, what would it be?
Yeah, this is a good question. It is really hard to name one. I think the big one for me is it's this kind of combination of creating a better narrative around how hard the work of teaching is, so that we can set a higher bar for what we might ask or expect teachers to do. I think it's so I just see it all the time. I think over the years, the proliferation of just stuff that we've added in, without really carefully thinking about it, is we have not set teachers up for success in terms of their practice, and we have underplayed the importance, or we've underplayed how hard it is to do the sort of core work of creating the conditions and delivering really high quality instruction. And I think a part of that is increasing the sort of the rigor of the rigor and accessibility, if you like, of the evidence base. So there's some good evidence. Well, first of all, there's not loads of good evidence out there, particularly as it relates to abuse of SEND. So there's more like research that needs to be done. The accessibility of that is a problem. A lot of it sits behind paywalls. The interpretation of it is a problem. Even when people are looking at like peer review journals, it's almost unfathomable to know like what this would mean for practice. So the interpretation of that, I think, kind of into teachers' practice, we need to do a much better job. But I think the bigger sort of piece is the kind of coherence of all of these things. So and actually we have quite a good opportunity, I think, to think about this. Teachers get lots of different things from lots of different directions, be that sort of policy guidance, like school expectations, the evidence base, like random bits of training that they get. It kind of comes from lots of different places, and how you actually make sense of that in a sort of a coherent way is, I think it's almost impossible. At a policy level, I think what we need to do is build better coherence across policy, across assessment, and across inspection. And with what's about to happen in the autumn term, I think there is an opportunity to do that. So we're going to get the schools white paper. There will be a skills white paper. There'll be the outcome of the curriculum assessment review, and of course the outcome of the accountability review as well, the Ofsted framework. I think there is an opportunity to use those things to much better, I don't know whether incentivize is the right word, but to much better kind of orchestrate or influence the activity of schools and teachers, such that we create a situation whereby, we're asking people to do probably less. We're creating more time for them to spend on the things that we know makes the biggest difference. I would say it's the coherence piece at sort of a policy and a system level, with a view to that creating better conditions for teachers to spend more time on stuff that's going to make the biggest difference on a day-to-day basis.
That and handwriting classes for all teachers.
Maybe for you, my handwriting's fine.
Fine. But I think part of the answer is teacher training. So I think the expertise of the teacher is, alongside the curriculum, the kind of greatest lever you have for improving the experiences and outcomes for students. And so we're lucky to have an early career framework in place that we didn't have 10 years ago. it'd be great to go even further and have even more like ongoing training for teachers for their career to help them become even more expert.
As I mentioned earlier, a central idea across this paper is the idea of instruction being kind of accessible by default, and that connecting to kind of what you might think of as like the broader idea of the paper of teaching becoming inclusive by default. When trying to change things in schools, you'll know better than I do that you can make changes, but it's often quite difficult to sustain them, and a crucial part of that is understanding whether the changes you've made have had the impact that you wanted them to have. And with that in mind, how might schools evaluate whether a shift that they've tried to put in place towards being inclusive by default, how would they be able to tell that it had the intended impact that they wanted?
So I think it would be, it's, as we know, it's very difficult to connect anything to people outcomes, but I think you would see a situation whereby teachers are able to spend more time on fewer things. There's the things that we know make the biggest difference. I think that the majority of activity would fall into that upstream activity rather than the downstream, reacting to things kind of where they haven't quite gone to plan. I think you just see an increase in teacher confidence and their ability to meet the needs of pupils with SEND. I think pupils with SEND would be, ultimately, actually, I think the whole use of the term SEND would change and hopefully become much less kind of prominent. But you would see pupils with additional needs being less at risk of sort of differentiated provision. Like you'd see higher levels of kids in classrooms interacting with, like age level content or grade level content is what they call it in the States, but content which is appropriately rigorous for their ages. That would be like suitably scaffolded, so that we're not reducing the kind of curriculum rigor of the content that they were experiencing. I think you'd see a reduced need or push for kind of statutory assessment. You just see less overall bureaucracy associated, and the sort of the administration of all of this, and then you may see some sort of, again, cause and correlation. You need to be super careful, but hopefully you would see better pupil related outcomes around perhaps things like attendance or perceptions of belonging, or kind of well-being. I think you would it might take some time, but hopefully you would we would say the beneficiaries of this being kids and their overall experience of education.
Yeah, nothing really to add there. I think with the kids' performance, well, specifically, like I'd say, narrowing the gap is what you'd expect to see, because there's like an instructional sensitivity effect. Those students, when you teach really well, it's those students who need it most or are the ones who end up benefiting the most. So you would see like a narrowing of the gap, like measuring some kind of belonging index to feel like students feel like they belong, and then staff workload and satisfaction, because if you get it right, teachers are going to be happier.
You speak to your staff. I mean, the phrase that I think Sam Sims uses about fluff load, a reduction of what he describes as, the fluff load of teaching, the bits of teaching where you say, oh, well, I love teaching and I love my job, but this bit just feels like a waste of time and I've got to do it. A reduction in that stuff is something that you'd hope to see, I'd imagine.
And better handwriting.
And better handwriting, of course. If you take one thing away from this, it's that I have no time whatsoever for secondary teacher. No. Yeah, as long as it's legible, I'm happy.
You need to bring your homework in next time you're on the podcast, Chris, just to make sure you're practicing. And because what you're describing there essentially almost sounds like a description of a really healthy system in general. Like you said, Jim, without needing to put a label on SEND pupils and things like that. There, if teachers are working less but are being more effective, and children feel more that sense of belonging, Peps, that we talked about a long time ago on the podcast, and are doing better at school, have better outcomes. And, that's what we're all hoping for. That's why we become teachers in the first place, isn't it? So, fingers crossed. It feels like this paper will be a really good springboard for a lot of conversations, and let's hope that some of those conversations are happening at a ministerial level, because I think that exasperation is only building on the classroom floor. So we'll see.
Yeah, important to call. Can I just call out two kind of caveats, K-Mac? First is that, you know, the stuff we've talked about today, it is what schools can do to try and like do their bit for alleviating the situation. But there are some like significant aspects of the problem which schools don't have any influence over and can't necessarily tackle, and we just need to call that out. Like schools will, I know they will have always and will continue to do their bit, but they won't be able to solve it all themselves. There's lots of like funding and legal issues and like centralized issues that need to be sorted. And then secondly, our conversation today has largely been about mainstream, and there will always be some students who basically do absolutely need something that is very different. And that's not really what we're talking about today. We're kind of assuming that to be true. And actually part of what we're talking about is making sure that those students who do have significant needs have the resources and support and time and attention available to help them. And by kind of, doing a better job of mainstream, you allow for that, enable that to happen.
I think, all I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. It's been a fascinating chat. Thank you, Chris.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Peps.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.